So first and foremost, I'm a person sitting in a room with another person, having a conversation. And that's important to say because I bring myself to the encounter. I don't put on a role of therapist. But my thinking and the way I work is informed by two main approaches. The first is the existential phenomenological approach, and the second is the psychodynamic approach. So they are quite weighty terms, which I will try to simplify. Existential psychotherapy is grounded in existential philosophy, which looks at what it means to exist, what it means to live as a human being in the world. And it acknowledges that there are limitations. We're born, we die, we don't choose where we're born or into what context or circumstance. But alongside those limitations, there is also a capacity for us to develop, to grow, to change, to make choices, even though that often seems impossible for us. And therefore, it probably makes sense that existential psychotherapy doesn't medicalize or pathologize human suffering. Instead, it understands suffering as an inevitable part of being human. And so it doesn't treat symptoms, but it looks to explore the possible meaning of symptoms, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The phenomenological part of existential approach looks at the lived experience, and through description rather than explanation, it tries to grasp what the experience is like for the person living in the world. So I don't sit as the expert over another person, and I don't assume that I know what it's like to be them, to live their life, to have lived their life and endured their experiences. I am trying all the time to understand what it's like for that person to be who they are, to live in their body, to have the relationships they have. And through our conversations, we are each building on our shared understanding of what their experiences are like. The psychodynamic approach understands that the way we relate to others and to ourselves is a consequence of our formative experiences and the environment that we grew up in. So our lived experience today can be connected to our early experiences growing up. We look at how different childhood experiences have impacted us and how we have evolved and coped with certain situations. We may look at coping mechanisms or adaptations that helped us to get through difficult circumstances. Although those ways of dealing with our difficulties helped us at the time and often helped us to survive, if we continue those ways of being in the world and in our life, can inhibit us and narrow our lives. So, for example, numbing our feelings or withdrawing from others into ourselves might have been the best and most ingenious way of dealing with adversity. But if we are still numbing ourselves and isolating ourselves from others, that brings immense pain and distress. So therapy is different for everyone, and I can try to describe the ways in which it can help, but it's really an experiential engagement, and so you really need to experience it to get a sense of what it might offer to you. I think therapy, or this kind of therapy, is subtle and deep, and it's nuanced and powerful. And I've heard people say to me variations of, I feel different, things feel different, things feel like they're beginning to change, but I don't understand how it's happened, or I can't pinpoint what's made it different. And I suppose it's a little bit like when we grow up. We don't point to one particular thing or one particular time, or usually we don't, and say, that's when it happened. And I think therapy can be a little bit like that. But therapy can be hugely cathartic. To be able to say the unsayable, to even think the unthinkable, sometimes it's too much for us even to go to those places in our own minds. Often, how we relate to others manifests in the therapeutic relationship itself. But in our everyday relationships, so much goes unsaid. And much of the work of therapy is working out what gets in the way of relating within the therapeutic relationship itself. Therapy can give the experience of someone being able to hear and hold what you say, and for someone to notice things about you that might be beyond your awareness, and that can be hugely reparative. It can be about finding a way to tell your story, but also being helped to challenge your story and your assumptions. And that can bring insights, and it can be enlightening and increase your understanding about yourself. Then it might be about seeing what's possible, about changes that you might want to make, about taking risks, because changing can feel risky. And it can be about noticing our strengths, which I think is a really important part, because often when we've had to go through difficult experiences and survive them, this points to our strength, even if we feel vulnerable about those things. Often it's about eventually finding compassion for ourselves. And this can be uncomfortable for people. I think people often wince at the idea of finding compassion for themselves, which really points to how cruel I think we can be to ourselves. But it's an important part, I believe, of the therapy. Finally, there is an idea that trauma has two parts to it. The first part is the source of the painful feelings, but the second part is the absence of what a philosopher and psychoanalyst, Robert Solero, calls a relational home. So if you imagine a child going through a very traumatic experience, and there is no one there to help them understand or work through or integrate that experience into their life, then that trauma sits stuck inside of them and they are alone with it, and the feelings that that evokes can be intolerable. But if you imagine that there is somebody there alongside them, helping them through the situation, helping them to understand what they've gone through and being with them, then that produces a very different outcome. And so the idea of therapy being a relational home, I think, is very important. So the initial session is an opportunity for us to meet and to see what it's like to talk to each other. It's an opportunity for you to begin to share what brings you to therapy and at this particular time. And I'm always interested to understand what your hopes and expectations are from the therapy. It can also be helpful to hear a little bit about your background, the family that you grew up in, the structure of your family, what relationships were like in the family, at school, a general idea of what it was like growing up. And sometimes this can be difficult for people because we can be protective over our past. But I always emphasize the point that it's very much about understanding and not about blame. But if you're coming to therapy with a crisis, then it's not particularly helpful to start asking questions about the past. So the areas covered in the initial session are very much dependent upon the needs of the person coming for therapy, and timing and pace is absolutely fundamental, as it is throughout the therapy. I'm also very keen to find out during the session how you're finding the session, what it's like for you to sit with this new person, a stranger, and share what you're sharing. And an initial session of therapy, and all sessions, can be very challenging and intense, and part of managing the anxiety is talking about it. So the focus on what you feel in the session is very important in the initial session, but it's also important ongoing throughout the therapy. I usually recommend having 4 sessions to really get a sense of what the therapy might be like. But of course, the choice is absolutely yours. If you do choose to return to the second session, I always like to find out what you were left with after the first session, what occurred to you afterwards, and how it felt for you. It can be intense having an initial session, and it can be very helpful to think about this together. There can be a number of different reasons why someone might want to end the therapy. And I always think the most important thing is to have clarity around your reasons. And that clarity can be gained by discussing your thinking with the therapist. Sometimes the desire to end therapy can be symptomatic of the reasons that brought you to therapy in the first place. So if somebody struggles with relationships or struggles with intimacy and often leaves relationships, it's quite likely that that might manifest in the therapeutic relationship itself. Also, sometimes people feel that they're getting too close to something that's too painful and they don't want to go there. That's very much part of the therapy. It's, I think, a given that therapy is difficult. It's not always difficult, but working through what's painful is necessary and part of the therapy. That said, if it feels too much, it's your choice if you want to stop. I would always say, if you can, to bring all of these thoughts to the therapy itself. And even if the decision is made to end, at least you've had the opportunity to think this through with the therapist and you leave with some sense of clarity. Of course, it might be that an individual doesn't feel a connection with their therapist and doesn't feel that the therapy is helping. And if it's possible to raise this with a therapist, it can be really helpful to try and get a deeper understanding. But the choice always belongs to you. Endings in therapy are an important part of therapy, as endings are an important part of life. We are confronted by endings all the time, endings and losses, and we end ourselves. So if in time it's felt that the timing is right to stop the sessions, you usually agree an end date and work towards that end date with your therapist, reviewing the therapy that's been covered, the journey that you've gone through, and also thinking about life after the therapy. But also, ending in therapy can evoke feelings around loss and trigger feelings around endings that you've experienced in your wider life. And so ending therapy gives an opportunity to think through and explore those losses or endings you've endured. And importantly, having a good ending and the opportunity to say goodbye is therapeutic in itself.